Welcome back to Tales of Knights and Magic. Subscribe if you like, and now get comfortable, and enjoy this glimpse into the world of fantasy. There was a time when the Royal Library of Astaran had meant something, when scholars traveled from across the continent to kneel before its shelves, to plead for permission to turn its pages. A time when its archivists were considered high priests of truth, and the preservation of knowledge was a sacred duty, not a clerical task. But that time had passed like the long shadow of an empire too proud to admit its own decay. Now the library stood as a relic, its grandeur dulled by the dust of bureaucracy. Its spires no longer pierced the clouds, only offered shelter to roosting crows. The stained glass murals depicting the founding of the Kingdom of Astaran had long since lost their color to sun and smoke, and the great bell that once rang to announce the discovery of a new text had not tolled in over 3 decades. And amid the rotting gold leaf and cracking marble, the head librarian sat at his desk, scratching corrections into the margins of a shipping manifest that predated him by a century. Elric Danamore, 83 years old, stooped and sharp-eyed despite the years, wore the same brown robes he'd worn since he first took his post. They smelled faintly of ink and lemon oil, of crushed petals used to ward off silverfish and the ghosts of spoiled bindings. His hair, what little of it remained, clung to the sides of his scalp like exhausted vines. His hands bore the curled look of parchment long exposed to flame, but they remained precise. He moved with the deliberation of someone who had stopped believing in urgency. The library was quiet. It was always quiet now. Young mages preferred their mirrored tablets and conjured texts, the kind that could rearrange themselves to match the reader's attention span. Few bothered to learn the old tongues. Fewer still visited the archive floors. Elric's desk sat beneath a great circular window in the east wing, where the light pooled in slow-moving circles of gold across the old floorboards. From this spot, he could see nearly everything: the check-in desks, the long rows of the fourth wing, where military records gathered dust, the tapestry-covered arches that led to the history vaults. No one ever looked up. They passed him like part of the scenery, a forgotten fixture, a chair that squeaked but was never replaced. He didn't mind. He had once dreamed of greatness, of becoming a master-level thaumaturge, of bending wind and steel with his voice alone, of being called to the royal court for counsel. But like so many with modest gifts, his path had narrowed slowly, imperceptibly, until he woke one day and realized the choice had been made for him. He had always loved books. Not the stories in them, though those had their charm, but the books themselves. The smell of old vellum, the weight of a binding done properly, with threads soaked in mint oil and witch salt, the crinkle of a page turned carefully with clean fingers. There was a kind of reverence in the preservation of knowledge, and if he had not been brilliant enough to write it, he would at least ensure it was remembered. He did not hate the life he had lived. He had simply resigned himself to it. It was on a late summer evening, as thunder rolled over the capital, and the heat rose in long, sluggish drafts through the marble pillars, that Elric first noticed the change. He had gone to the prayer scripts, not to read them, for he had long since memorized their contents, but to clean. A row of old vellum pages bound in gold wire, marked with the seals of forgotten gods. They sat untouched in the second vault, behind 3 sets of barred doors, and a forgotten protocol no one had enforced since the days of High Scribe Helmort. The stone shelves beneath them had always been stable, until now. He leaned on his cane as he stepped forward, only to feel the slightest give in the floor beneath him. Not a crack, a tremor. Curious, he cleared the scrolls, ran his hand across the stone, found a faint seam. There was no latch, no keyhole, just pressure. He pressed his palm flat, nothing. Then again with 2 fingers, the seam shivered, a line of dust lifted from the edge. The stone hissed inward, and a narrow stair revealed itself in absolute silence. He stood very still, listened. Nothing came from below. He lit a palm globe, his spellwork still serviceable despite age, and descended. The passage wound tightly, tighter than the tower stairs, too narrow for anything grand. The air grew cold in the way of untouched places. Not moldy, not damp, just empty. The glow reflected off iron plates embedded in the walls. Old craftsmanship. Pre-unification, maybe older. They had no rust, just symbols too worn to read. When he reached the bottom, he stood before a door not made of wood or stone, but black steel so perfectly smooth it hurt the eye to look at. It bore no lock, only a single symbol at its center, a triangle intersected by 3 circles, one filled in, the others hollow. He knew the symbol. He'd seen it in a banned grimoire confiscated in his apprentice years, the seal of unwitnessed knowledge. He remembered the head archivist's voice, stern and certain. There are things we record but do not read. There are doors we document but do not open. To preserve truth is not always to touch it. Elric reached out and placed his hand on the seal. The door opened inward without a sound. He entered the black archives. The air had weight, not pressure, presence. Like the breath of the place had settled still over everything, waiting to be disturbed. The chamber was circular, the walls lined with shelves that curved without end. No corners, no natural light. The floor was black stone, etched with a spiral that never quite reached the center. The books varied, some bound in leather, others in skin. A few floated above the shelves, tethered by chains of silver and salt. One shelf bore nothing but bone scrolls, etched with acid ink. Another held tomes that flickered when approached, shifting their titles to avoid being seen. Elric stood for a long time before he moved. Then, with hands steadier than they had been in years, he selected the first book. No title. The cover cracked when touched. He opened it, read. The script twisted itself slightly as he focused, as if adjusting to his understanding. He read of unspoken spells, of bindings that transcended place, of sacrificial equivalents, and mirrors that remembered blood. He read of necromantic principles, so cleanly described that they rendered half the Academy's theology moot. He read until the palm glow dimmed, and his back ached from standing. Then he read more. The first night he descended, he left the chamber with the gait of a younger man. The second night, he brought a blank tome and a red quill. By the fifth, he had memorized 3 incantations that no longer existed in any spoken tongue. By the 20th, he began to wonder how many years he had left. Not because he feared death, but because he feared stopping. He had found greatness at last, and it had come too late, until he read of the reversion. Not a ritual, a theory. Half recorded, fractured, but possible. A turning of the self backward through time. Not the world, not the body, just the soul, the memory, the self. But it required sacrifice. Something unique, something impossibly rare, something that would not exist in the altered timeline, and so could not be used again. And Elric, old, alone, and invisible to the world, knew where to find it. He had recorded its location himself, years ago, hidden behind a stack of sealed relics in Vault 6. A gem, blue-red, smooth as still water, the heart of Ivor. He would take it, he would use it, and he would begin again. Elric had always imagined that if the end of his life ever held significance, it would be accompanied by finality, some cold conclusion to years of quiet service, perhaps marked by a ceremony attended out of obligation, a brief letter of thanks from a noble who had never learned his name, and then a fading into the footnotes of bureaucratic history. But now that he had found the black archives, now that he had walked among tomes that breathed and shelves that whispered, now that he had read the fractured formula for the reversion, he found himself haunted by something altogether different, possibility. Not greatness as he had once envisioned it in youth, not the flashy power of court mages, or the brutal simplicity of battlefield sorcerers, but a different kind of legacy, one rooted in endurance, in secrecy, in the mastery of truths so old they had become invisible. The spell that consumed his thoughts was not simply a turning back of time. It was the reclamation of a life wasted, the memory, the self, the sum total of everything he had learned, all cast backward into a younger vessel unburdened by the erosion of age, or the mediocrity of an unlived ambition. But it required sacrifice, and not the metaphorical kind. The magic demanded something irreplaceable, something unique, something bound not just in rarity, but in essence, an artifact whose presence could not be duplicated in the timeline he would return to. That treasure, he knew, lay sealed in the vaults of the royal treasury beneath the east wing of the palace, in a sub-level few even knew existed. It was called the Heart of Ivor, a crystalline fragment born during the Silence Era, when magic had no names and sorcerers carved spells into flesh, because parchment could not contain their intent. The heart was an object of compression, capable of anchoring memory through trauma, of holding enchantments through death, of preserving meaning beyond history. It had been discovered in the wreckage of a ruined altar, catalogued by mistake, and eventually buried beneath a pile of less dangerous artifacts, simply because no one dared study it too closely. Elric had once overseen a treasury audit that included the heart, and at the time he remembered thinking it beautiful, translucent and warm to the touch, despite the cold of the vault. He remembered staring into it and seeing not his reflection, but a sense of reflection, as though the gem mirrored not the face but the will. That was the price the spell demanded, and he could not deny that he was willing to pay it. Stealing the heart would be difficult, but not impossible. One of the benefits of being forgotten was access. Unquestioned, unchecked, and often unguarded. The palace guards knew his face. They had seen him shuffle past their posts with armfuls of old maps and fragile manuscripts, muttering about misplaced records and restoration requests. None would think it strange if he appeared near the vaults, and few would even register that he was there. He waited for the midwinter recalibration, a 10-day period when the royal archive was closed for scribe rotation and magical realignment, and the palace turned its attention toward ritual cleansing and ceremonial finance review. On the 6th day, as snow piled against the arched windows and the sound of distant choirs echoed through the marble halls, Elric donned his work robes, gathered 2 sealed scroll cases marked with fictitious inspection seals, and made his way through the under corridors toward Vault 6. He encountered no resistance. The ward at the outer chamber responded to his clearance rune, a faded ring inscribed with an enchantment, so old even its caster had likely forgotten its activation phrase. The guards nodded, eyes already glazed by the long hours of tedium. He passed the threshold, entered the chamber, and paused in the silence. The vault was vast, larger than it should have been, its ceiling vaulted in soft arcs, lit by mage lanterns designed to respond only to the presence of sanctioned archivists. Shelves stretched like ribs, each bearing objects too dangerous or obscure for use. He walked quickly, not because of fear, but because his resolve was fragile, and he feared what hesitation might allow to grow in his chest. The heart of Ivor lay where he had last seen it, encased in a box of saltwood and glass, unmarked save for a faded catalog number etched in charcoal script. He opened the case with shaking hands, removed the gem, and held it against his chest. It pulsed, once, not like a heartbeat, more like recognition, as though it knew him, as though it had been waiting. He placed the false scrolls in the case, sealed it again, and left. No one stopped him. That night, he descended into the black archives and began the ritual. The circle he drew was not chalk or ash, but a weave of lines etched in memory, borrowed from half-burned grimoires and reconstructed from forbidden margins. He placed the heart at the center, surrounded it with offerings of silence, a quill never used, a blank page from the Book of Intentions, and a drop of his own blood, drawn from the hollow of his palm. The spell required not incantation, but surrender. He gave it everything: his name, his age, his regrets, the entire ledger of a life unfulfilled. The heart of Ivor cracked, not shattered, cracked like a sky split by lightning. The light that poured from it was not bright but true, a kind of illumination that revealed nothing and everything all at once. Then came darkness, and then, the first sound of birdsong. Elric opened his eyes. The ceiling was too low. The smell was wrong. Not parchment and wax, but wood polish and old linen. He sat up, the bed creaked. His arms were thin, yes, but unwrinkled. His breath came sharp, fast. His legs responded when he swung them over the side of the bed. He stood, wobbled, stared at the reflection in the dusty mirror above the wash basin. A boy, 10 years old, pale, sharp-featured, eyes bright with knowledge he had no right to carry. He laughed, then cried, then sat on the floor and began to recite every spell he had memorized. It took him 3 hours to remember that no one knew who he was anymore. He had not simply returned to youth, he had returned to obscurity. His mother was still alive, busy in the lower kitchen with morning chores. His father was still a distant presence in the family banking house, gruff and distracted. No siblings, no expectations, just a quiet boy known for reading too much and speaking too little. He played the role well. For the first month, he said little, observed, wrote in secret, began to recreate diagrams from memory, tested the simplest wards behind the woodshed. When he failed, he corrected. When he succeeded, he recorded. His body learned faster than it had the first time, his hands steadier, his intent cleaner. He made no attempt to draw attention to himself. Teachers at the small local academy noted that he was bright, if withdrawn. The headmaster offered to send a recommendation to the Eskrell Institute again. Elric declined, politely. He did not need another formal education. He needed time. By his 11th birthday, he had reconstructed 5 minor incantations from the archives, devised a method to test structural enchantments without drawing ether, and memorized half the known languages of binding. He spent evenings in the town's abandoned chapel, reinforcing its frame with passive wards and sealing the lower crypt for use as a workspace. He was no longer a boy. He was a ghost of the man he had once been, returned not for redemption or glory, but for mastery. The world would not see him coming, but it would remember him when he arrived. The chapel had been abandoned long before Elric's first life began. It stood at the edge of the old grave path on the north side of town, half swallowed by ivy, its steeple broken from some ancient lightning strike that had turned the weathered iron bell into a tangle of melted metal. Few passed that way now except wandering cats and the occasional drunk too, lost to care where he stumbled. It made the perfect sanctuary. He'd cleared the rotting pews in the first week after his return, stripped away the warped boards, and laid out binding lines across the stone foundation with chalk mixed from crushed charcoal, salt, and the ash of his own hair. That particular mixture wasn't necessary for any known spell. It was a trick he'd read once in a half-legible appendix from a banned treatise called The Breathing Circle. The theory was that a space remembered better if it tasted something personal. Whether it was true or not, the crypt beneath the chapel had begun to feel alive since he'd started the work. Not sentient, but reactive. Dust settled only where he didn't tread. Candles burned longer than their wax should allow. Echoes didn't fade, they waited. He spoke to no one about the chapel. Not his tutors, not his parents, not the academy clerk who visited twice a year to ask if young Elric would reconsider attending one of the regional boarding halls for magical youth. He smiled, bowed, and refused each time with such softness they almost thanked him for his disinterest. Let the prodigies gather in their tower classrooms and parrot back lessons barely older than the buildings themselves. Elric was chasing a deeper route. Each night he descended into the crypt with a bundle of copied notes and a lantern smeared in rune-dampening paste, and each morning he returned with his hands smudged in ink, and his mind 2 degrees sharper. He practiced inkless sigils on the stone walls until they stuck without touch. He tested his reconstructed tether spells on stray moths, tracking how long they lingered inside the loops before fading. He trained his young body to move with the restraint of an old man and the patience of a scholar. By the time he turned 12, he could feel the shape of his previous life settling inside his new one. He didn't remember everything perfectly, not dates or names, but he remembered process, theory, the logic behind spells, and the patterns that old magic obeyed. He remembered the way forbidden power had to be invited, not commanded, that the spells which endured were the ones the world had tried hardest to forget. And most of all, he remembered that the true danger of the Black Archives wasn't what they could teach, but how easily they could make you believe you'd earned what you'd only inherited. He had not earned anything yet. He was still rebuilding, but the work was his, and that mattered. He discovered the first anomaly in late autumn. The leaves had gone brittle, and the night carried that strange clean cold that preceded snow. He'd been working on a mnemonic lock, an idea he'd adapted from a hex buried in the 12th chapter of the Pale Codex, designed to prevent any unauthorized reader from understanding a text unless they shared the caster's precise emotional state. He was testing it on a fake ledger when the ink refused to hold. Not blurred, not smudged. It slid off the page like oil on glass. He blinked, tried again. The ink pooled at the edge of the glyph and dripped to the floor. He waited, then reached out, touched the page with 2 fingers, and whispered a tracing command. The ink snapped back into place like it had never moved. He sat down hard, back against the crypt wall, and laughed. Quiet, breathless laughter. This was new, not just unfamiliar, but undocumented. The spell had reacted to his body before his mind completed the command. It had anticipated his intent. That wasn't supposed to happen until the 6th convergence layer, and even then, only with spells designed to adapt. He stood, paced, repeated the sequence. Again the ink obeyed, but faster this time. He tried changing his mood, faked irritation, confusion, even fear. The ink stalled. When he calmed himself again, it flowed. The spell wasn't learning. He was, or rather, his magic was resonating with the spell, like it had always known this part of him, and was waiting for him to catch up. He made note of it, documented the result, then locked the test book in the oldest iron box he could find. This was no longer experiment. It was precedent. The next day, a messenger arrived at the estate with a letter from the Council of Arcane Custodians, an invitation, gilded in wax and tradition. They had reviewed his early notes, submitted years ago by the Elric that had once been, and wished to assess his progress for early integration into one of the provincial circles. It was, by all accounts, an honor. Even the house steward, who normally avoided eye contact, congratulated him. Elric accepted the letter with a bowed head and a promise to consider the offer. He spent the rest of the evening in the chapel, tearing the letter into pieces and feeding them one by one to a candle lit with ember light from a cursed tome. He didn't want their institutions. He wanted their secrets. And secrets didn't live in council halls. They lived in hidden rooms and forgotten graves, and at the bottom of ancient staircases no one dared descend. He had found one already. He would find more. Winter settled over the town like a closing hand. The snow came in slow, heavy waves, blanketing the streets and rooftops until the world lost its sharpness. Most children stayed inside, learning winter spells from their tutors or huddled near hearths with storybooks. Elric spent his days mapping a partial recreation of the Black Archives. He remembered the curvature of the original chamber, the spiral that never reached the center, the order of the shelves according to threat and purpose. He recreated the layout in charcoal on the chapel crypt floor, adjusting it slightly to accommodate the space, correcting a few geometries he now realized had been flawed in the original design. He began carving names, not full names, fragments, words remembered from bindings and banishments, terms that once held power and now served as seeds. He traced each one with care, layered them with salt, and whispered old syllables into the cracks between bricks. The crypt responded, not dramatically. There were no bursts of light, no thunderous affirmations, but the air shifted, grew thicker, more alert. One night, as he was finishing a resonance ward around the false spiral's outer edge, he felt a tremor, barely perceptible, a ripple through the chalk. He leaned down, placed his palm flat on the stone, whispered, "Show me." A word appeared beneath his hand, not drawn, formed, as if the stone itself had always carried the word, and merely waited for him to uncover it. Soften. He didn't know it, not entirely, but it stirred something in the deeper corners of his memory. He wrote it down, began researching. Every book, every scroll, every discarded volume he could steal, copy or barter, nothing, no history, no reference, just the word, soften. He tried saying it aloud. The candle flickered. He tried whispering it again, while drawing a minor ward. The ward bent, not broke, bent, like it heard something older than instruction. He didn't test it again. Instead, he began sealing the crypt more carefully, not with force, with invitation. He left space for the word to linger, shaped each sigil so it could fit beside that unknown name, adjusted the spiral's lines to fold inward a little more, as though drawing breath. Weeks passed, and then one night, without warning, a page appeared at the center of the spiral, not written, not placed, just there, blank. He reached for it. His fingers stopped a hair's breadth away. The air between them felt solid, charged. He pulled his hand back, lit another candle. The page remained. He did not touch it. He did not write on it. He simply waited, because some secrets, he had learned, did not require chasing, only recognizing, and this one had found him. The page remained at the spiral's center for 2 days, unmoved, untouched, and undisturbed by the low candlelight that washed the chamber in amber hues. Elric returned each night, with the full intention of interacting with it, perhaps to test its composition, to examine the weave of its fibers, to read what magic clung to its corners, but each time he stepped close enough to feel the subtle heat radiating from its surface, his hand stopped short, not from fear or uncertainty, but from a deeper instinct cultivated over 2 lifetimes. The recognition that some things are not meant to be handled until the world itself decides you are worthy of them. He studied it instead. He watched how the shadows curled away from it, as though unwilling to rest upon it. He observed the way its edges remained crisp, despite the draft that swept through the chapel's cracked stone and warped timbers. He even noted, in one quiet moment of stillness, that the dust in the room no longer settled on it. It was not resisting its environment, it was simply not part of it, so he adjusted his routine. Each evening, after reviewing his transcriptions and layering additional protective wards across the upper corners of the crypt, he would sit cross-legged at a respectful distance from the spiral's center and observe the page, committing every minute detail to memory, waiting for any sign of change. The change came not in the paper, but in the room. The longer it remained, the more the air thickened. The glow of his rune-marked candles burned steadier, and his breath began to linger longer in the cold. The stone walls, which once echoed every footfall and whispered chant, grew silent, not quiet, but utterly still, as though the very stones were listening. One night, while copying a particularly obscure incantation from a reconstructed memory of the flayed ledger, he looked up to find that the spiral had deepened, the charcoal marks he'd drawn now appearing recessed into the floor, like grooves etched into flesh. The page had not moved, but it now sat slightly lower, as if being drawn downward, absorbed into something unseen. He stopped working that night, extinguished the candles carefully, and locked the chapel with 6 overlapping sigils. The key to all of them was a sequence only he knew, built from a phrase in an extinct dialect he had never written down. He returned home through the snow-covered streets with his breath steaming behind him, each step deliberate, each corner watched. He felt no eyes, but that meant little. The kind of attention this kind of power attracted didn't wear boots or cloaks or badges. It seeped, and if the spiral had truly begun to pull something through, Elric needed to be ready for more than just observation. In the weeks that followed, he expanded his research. Using the memories he still retained from the Black Archives and his own growing collection of recreated texts, he began cross-referencing phenomena associated with manifestation magic, instances where magical intent crossed the boundary into physical reality without incantation or catalyst. Most records were vague, riddled with metaphor and contradiction, but a pattern emerged in the margins. In every account, the object or entity that manifested without direct summoning always aligned itself with a specific phrase, a single word repeated not aloud, but in thought, over time. It was not invocation, but resonance. The page in the spiral, he realized, had not simply arrived. It had been invited by his presence, by his pattern, by his meticulous routines and silent understanding. It had recognized him. The word returned to him. Sothan. He didn't test it immediately, but he began integrating it, subtly, into his spells. He built it into sentence structures as a silent anchor, placed it beneath layers of warding runes where only the magic could feel it. The results were small at first, stronger longevity in ink, less resistance when shaping glyphs in water or smoke. Then more notable effects emerged. Sigils held longer than they should. Reactive spells predicted failure states and corrected themselves. And in one case, a bloodline binding sigil that should have required 3 nights and a live offering instead, completed in a single hour using only hair. The magic was responding not just to his will, but to the word. Sothan was not a command, it was a presence, a signature. The page in the spiral never altered in appearance. But one night, Elric noticed that the chalk lines nearest it had begun to discolor, faintly bronzing as if exposed to long-forgotten light. He reinforced them. The spiral remained stable, but it was no longer inert. He began documenting each subtle alteration, every shift in tone and temperature, every time his ink curved slightly to the left when it should have dried straight. The magic was learning him as he learned it. Then, without preamble, the page turned itself. It did not flutter. It did not lift. It simply rotated in place, revealing its underside. There, centered in crisp, dark ink, was a phrase he had not written. It read, "Ink is not required." Elric froze. He reread the phrase 10 times. No signature, no markings, no instructions, just the sentence, simple and absolute. He whispered it aloud. The page did not react. He reached toward it, again stopping just short. This time, the heat was gone, the air was cool, inviting. He placed his fingers on the paper. It did not resist. It felt normal. A page, a surface, nothing more. A page, a surface, nothing more. He retrieved a blank sheet from his satchel, placed it beside the artifact. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he focused, not on writing, but on intent, on shape, on memory. He thought of the glyph for silence, the one he had used in his first reconstructed ward. He imagined it forming, inkless, on the page. He visualized the curves, the pressure of the pen, the way it should look when complete. When he opened his eyes, it was there, drawn perfectly in blank relief, invisible, unless the light hit it from the right angle. The glyph had imprinted itself onto the page without any physical action. No ink, no tool, just will. He sat back, heart hammering in his chest, and stared at the impossible. The implications were enormous. Inkless casting was a theory only referenced in the most esoteric texts, the kind of speculation that got one blacklisted from reputable circles. The idea that magic could be impressed upon the world without material components, without voice or gesture, purely through sustained thought, had always been ridiculed as metaphysical nonsense. But here it was, before him, a perfect sigil formed from nothing but the shape of belief and discipline. He spent the following month testing it. He tried other symbols, entire spell sequences, layered wards and complex bindings. Some failed, many succeeded. Every success reinforced the notion that his presence, his very pattern, was being recognized by something deeper than spellcraft. He built more pages, stored them in sealed containers, cataloged each result. He did not speak to anyone about it. He saw no one beyond brief exchanges in town. His parents, long since accustomed to his isolation, let him be. They knew only that he read, that he studied, that he was quiet and polite and asked for little. They had no idea that their son was rebuilding the architecture of ancient magic beneath their town. One morning, a courier arrived with a parchment sealed in gold wax. Another invitation from a distant school. This time, a more serious one. The name bore weight. Elric turned it over once, twice, then tossed it into the fire. The world outside had nothing for him. The world beneath him had only just begun to speak, and he intended to learn its entire language. The snow began to thaw in late first moon, retreating in slow veins along the slate rooftops and spilling down the cobbled lanes in quiet rivulets. Most of the town welcomed it. Merchants began setting out their carts again. Schools reopened their doors, and the blacksmith's son resumed his daily routine of slamming hot iron against cold anvils while humming off-key songs about saints no one truly prayed to anymore. But for Elric, now in his 13th year, the melt marked more than a change in season. It marked a shift in pace. The slow, isolating rituals of winter had allowed him to dive deeper into the reconstructed spells of the archives, pushing the boundaries of what could be tested within the protection of the chapel's crypt. But the thaw meant longer days, increased movement, and the return of eyes to streets that had for months belonged only to memory and shadows. The chapel would be noticed again soon, and its appearance, already suspicious in its growing cleanliness and lack of deterioration, would draw attention if left unchecked. He'd already repainted the upper beams with dulling varnish and scattered soot across the fresher stones to maintain the illusion of abandonment, but that was temporary. He needed contingency. He needed a second space. Elric began scouting in the early evenings, venturing beyond the grave paths and into the hollow runs beneath the western quarter, old mine tunnels that had once served as escape routes during the revolt of the Forelords, now half collapsed and long forgotten by anyone whose memory didn't stretch back over a century. He used maps that no longer existed in the town records, hand-copied from brittle documents once stored in the back of the eastern vaults before the building was modernized. Most passages were too narrow, too dangerous, or too flooded to be of use. But after 2 weeks of careful navigation and one near collapse that cost him the hearing in his left ear for 3 days, he found a chamber. Rough-hewn, dome-shaped, dry. It stank of sulfur and damp clay, but it was stable, and better still, the faint magical resonance in the air hinted at something old and buried nearby, something that had once been bound but had long since ceased resisting its own name. He didn't move anything right away. First, he spent nights sealing the access tunnels, creating redundant paths, laying non-lethal counterwords that would confuse or disorient anyone who didn't follow the right entry sequence. Then he replicated the spiral. Not perfectly. The stone floor couldn't hold chalk, so he carved it slowly with a runed chisel borrowed from the town's forgotten shrine to Leverin the scribe god. He set the lines with oil, burned incense made from crushed pine and dried marrow root, and waited. He didn't expect the page to return. That, he understood, had been a singular moment, an invitation not likely to be repeated. But the space needed to be ready. If the magic was moving, if the structures of the world were beginning to take notice of him, the way he had learned to notice them, then the room had to be a vessel, not a fortress. In the meantime, the inkless glyphs continued to develop. He discovered that repetition mattered, not just in shape, but in emotion. If he tried to imprint a ward when angry, the lines twisted. If he forced calm, the magic resisted. Only when he truly embodied the state he intended did the mark take root. That realization changed everything. It meant magic was not a tool, it was a reflection. And the archive spells, those half-lost, heavily guarded techniques once believed to be too dangerous for practice, were not dangerous because of their effects, but because they required honesty. They exposed the caster to themselves in ways that could not be faked, hurried, or mitigated. By mid-spring, Elric had created 27 successful inkless scripts, bound 6 creatures, mice, birds, a cat that had tried to bite his wrist, and developed 2 independent surveillance spells that functioned without Aether tethers. He kept journals in multiple locations, encrypted with abstract diagrams only he understood. Some he buried beneath trees marked with ancestral names. Others he sealed behind broken hearthstones in derelict homes. One he burned entirely after transcribing its contents to memory, just to be certain it couldn't be found. And still, the page in the chapel spiral remained. It hadn't turned again, hadn't faded or burned or grown in number. It simply sat, eternally still, bearing the same phrase as it had the night it changed. Ink is not required. The more he thought about it, the more he realized it hadn't been a message. It had been a statement of entry. an initiation, a condition. He had met it, now he waited for the next. It came not in the form of a page, but a dream. Elric had never placed much stock in dreams. His memories of his old life were sharp enough to separate dream from premonition, imagination from warning. But this was different. He stood in the chapel alone, as he often did, the spiral beneath his feet glowing faintly with blue-white light. The candles flickered in unnatural rhythm, and above him the broken bell rang though no wind stirred. A figure stood across the spiral, faceless, cloaked not in darkness but in obscurity, an absence so perfect it shaped the world around it by contrast. The figure didn't speak, it simply raised a hand, and with one slow gesture erased the spiral, not destroyed it. Erased it, as though it had never been there at all. Elric stepped forward, tried to redraw it. His hand moved, but the lines would not form. The floor rejected them. The space rejected him. He woke gasping, his hands trembling. He descended immediately to the chapel crypt. Everything was as it should be, the spiral untouched, the page unmoved, the air calm. Yet the dream remained lodged in his spine, a chill that would not melt. Something was watching, not him, precisely, not his actions, his progress. He began testing more complex scripts, not the dangerous ones. He wasn't ready to court madness or entropy, but the structural ones, the enchantments designed to create magical frames for future spells to rest within. He built one into the chapel's doorframe, embedding layers of perception distortion to dissuade investigation. He carved another into the base of the town statue of the first magistrate, turning the area into a passive memory sink, so no one who passed nearby would retain sharp impressions of their surroundings. Both worked, both reinforced what he already knew. His control was growing. One evening, while redrawing the inner spiral in the lower chamber, he cut his palm, a careless slip. Blood spilled across the chalk, beating at first, then soaking into the stone. He hissed, wrapped his hand quickly, prepared to redo the lines. But the blood didn't blur the glyphs. It sharpened them. The red contrasted with the chalk. Yes, but more than that, the lines seemed to align in ways they hadn't before, as though the magic now saw him more clearly. He let it dry, marked the event. That night, the page turned again, not once, not twice. 3 full turns. Each side bore a new phrase. The first, ink is not required. The second, blood sharpens memory. The third, truth binds faster than clarity. He sat beside it for hours, trying to understand. The second made sense. The third felt directed. Truth binds faster than clarity, meaning perhaps that the spell did not care whether one understood it, only that it was true. That made sense. Emotion over intellect, intent over articulation. That was the archive way. That was why it had always eluded so many. He began experimenting with internal truths, spells that mirrored his own thoughts, bindings based on confession. He whispered half admissions into the spiral as he cast, and the magic responded. He stated things aloud, fears, desires, regrets, and watched the sigils tighten, refine, glow. He realized, with slow awe, that he could now build spells that learned him, that wrapped not around targets, but around self. He constructed a memory palace inside his own mind, room by room, door by door. He populated it with moments from both lives, encoded in symbols, drawn in silent ink. The page watched, the spiral deepened, and at the end of the month, a second page appeared. No phrase, just a glyph. One he recognized from the earliest days of his study, the mark of lineage, of claim. Not you are ready, but you are known. He didn't sleep for 3 days. He had not reached the end. He had reached the threshold, and now, something behind it waited. The second page rested beside the first, as if it had always belonged there, unassuming in form yet carrying a pressure that made the air hum quietly whenever Elric drew near. He stared at it for nearly an hour after its arrival, examining every curve of the glyph etched into its surface, tracing and retracing the design with his eyes until he could recall it in perfect clarity with his eyes closed. It was the mark of lineage, a sigil not used in common spellcraft, but found scrawled in the border margins of the oldest sections of the Black Archives, stamped into forbidden tomes that had not been opened in over a century. This particular glyph denoted inheritance, not of blood or title, but of burden, of responsibility through knowing. A mark that appeared not when one claimed knowledge, but when knowledge claimed them. That was what disturbed him. Not the symbol itself, but the implication that something beyond his understanding had already decided he belonged to it. No spell had been cast, no ritual performed. The page had appeared because he had done enough. because he had become something, and now it was no longer just Elric watching the pages. The chapel crypt no longer felt like a place of preparation. It felt like a room with two doors, one behind him that he'd long since closed, and one ahead that had begun, ever so slightly, to creak open. He could not step through yet, but he could see the outline, feel the draft. He spent the following days reinforcing the spiral again, not because it was weakening, but because it had started to attract things. The air at the edges of the crypt had begun to feel stretched, and the shadows lingered longer than they should. He caught movement once, barely, a flicker at the edge of vision. Something crouched low and fast that vanished the moment his head turned. He set binding wards in the shape of forgotten prayers, marked the upper beams of the chapel with runes too faint to detect without a truth light, and redrew the spiral not with chalk this time, but with finely powdered bone dust mixed into white ash, bound together by oil pressed from blackthorn root. When the spiral was complete, he placed both pages back at its center, one beside the other, and sat in silence for 3 nights, doing nothing but watching them, breathing, learning the rhythm of the room. On the 3rd night, the glyph on the 2nd page pulsed, not with light, but with something deeper, a kind of subtle resonance that struck through his bones like a chime, only he could hear. Then faintly, a 3rd page began to appear, not dropped or placed, but grown, like mold from certainty. It took form slowly, its edges materializing over the course of hours, and when it was complete, it bore no symbols, no text, no message, only a texture, a smoothness so perfectly unnatural that it looked wet despite being dry to the touch. When he laid his hand upon it, no words came, no flash of understanding struck him, only a cold certainty that it was not for now, it was for later, and his task in the meantime was to become the kind of being who would know what to do with it. He turned his attention back to the town. He couldn't afford to stay hidden forever. Questions would come. Already he'd seen more people wandering near the chapel than usual, mothers collecting their children by the shoulder and quickening their pace, tradesmen throwing glances at the boarded windows. He suspected one of the town stewards had noticed the cleaned eaves and remarked on it. He began diverting attention. During the day he created false signs of animal activity, scattered feathers, claw marks on old pews, the occasional bloody rag half buried in the dirt. Rumors followed. Some claimed a sick wolf had made its den there. Others whispered of lingering hauntings from the wars. By the time the spring festival arrived, the chapel had earned a new nickname, the Hollow Shrine. Parents warned their children not to linger there after sundown. The town's priest placed a modest ward around its outer threshold, and then left it alone. Elric let them believe it was cursed. Let them build myths around it. It served his purpose better than secrecy. By the first heat of summer, his underground chamber was fully functional. He'd embedded a series of directional runes into the approach tunnels that caused sound to echo in misleading patterns, confusing any who attempted to follow his path. His journals had doubled, his maps of theoretical spell forms had grown complex enough to fill half the walls. He created 3 stable constructs using his inkless method, each a different shape, each designed to trigger under specific mental conditions. One was a sphere of silence that enveloped him when he spoke a certain phrase in panic. The second was a mirror of himself that could last for 3 minutes, enough to confuse a pursuer. The third was not a defense at all, it was a gate. Not a teleportation gate, not a portal, but a place marker spell, capable of locking the location of his body in the mind of the room itself. A bond between space and self. The spell would make the chamber remember him, so that even if he died elsewhere, his magic would know how to return. He called it the Recall Route. He hadn't read it anywhere. It came to him one night while meditating beneath the unfinished circle of lineage. A thought not seeded by memory, but sparked by proximity to something else. A reaching from beyond the edge of awareness. He tested it with caution, first marking the room with a signature glyph formed from breath condensation and sustained emotion, then layering it with pulses of his heartbeat recorded through magic. The chamber responded. The air warmed. The stone beneath his feet accepted the bond. He did not share this spell with any of his notes. It belonged to the archive, and still the 3rd page sat waiting. A reminder that all of this, his rituals, his studies, his discipline, was the preparation for something larger. Not power, not conquest, not revenge against the towers, or the nobles, or the world that had dismissed him. It was the slow, deliberate reconstruction of a soul, reforged from failure, and fed by the memory of everything he had once allowed to slip through his fingers. It was in late fire month that the storm came, blowing in from the northern peaks with such force that whole trees cracked at the base, and 2 of the older rooftops in town collapsed under the weight of sudden hail. The power went out in 3 districts. Water froze in the wells, and the chapel, despite being abandoned, broken, and warded only by a few faint illusions, remained untouched. The morning after, townsfolk whispered. They gathered near the grave path in silence, staring at the untouched snow on the chapel roof, the unbroken icicles hanging from the bell. Someone left an offering, a handful of copper and a sprig of ash leaf. Elric found it when he checked the wards and smiled. Superstition had done more for his security than any cloaking spell could have. But the storm brought more than snow. It brought the man. Elric noticed him first from the attic of the estate, a tall figure in a long gray cloak standing just outside the chapel's edge. His posture too still, too precise to be native to the town. He stood with his hands behind his back, face shadowed by his hood, staring at the spiral etched invisibly into the soil before the chapel's outer door. Then, without a word, he turned and left. No footsteps, no tracks in the snow. Elric said nothing, but he returned to the spiral that night and added a new page of his own. Not one that appeared, one he created. Upon it, he wrote a single phrase, observed. He placed it beneath the second page, watched the third. It did not move. But for the first time, the air around it seemed thinner, less certain. He returned to the estate, and began preparing for contact. Elric began preparing for contact, not with panic or haste, but with the same disciplined method he applied to all things, treating the encounter not as a disruption of his work, but as its logical next step. The figure who had stood at the chapel's edge, unmoving and uninvited, was not an accident. Nothing around the Black Archives was accidental. Elric had known, even in his earliest studies, that knowledge was never inert. It moved through the world like current beneath still water, sometimes pulling in the curious, other times dragging in the unworthy. Now that something or someone had noticed the spiral, it was only a matter of time before whatever came next would require more than passive defense and distant obfuscation. It would require understanding. So he began constructing simulations. Every night in the spiral chamber, beneath the false chapel that by now had grown into something more than architecture, and something less than sanctum, Elric mapped out the variables. He called them echoes, shades of possibility projected by layering conjured memory with suspended emotion. Each echo took on a form similar to the figure he had seen, tall, cloaked, restrained in posture and movement. He programmed them not with commands, but with questions, basic responses to being observed, patterns of gaze, angles of movement. He measured their reactions to speech, to silence, to presence and absence. He studied their effect on the spiral's resonance field. It took 8 days to produce a response. One of the echoes, when placed precisely at the northern arc of the spiral's outer ring, caused the third page to shiver slightly, not visibly, not violently, but enough that the thin air in the chamber thickened for a breath, and the glyphs around the spiral's edge glowed faintly before dimming. Elric repeated the test 3 times, each time the same result. That arc mattered. That position mattered. It wasn't a summoning ritual, it wasn't a ward trigger, it was recognition. He began sleeping in the spiral room, resting in short intervals, drifting in and out of dreams that twisted into half-thought spells and fading words. One dream returned more than once, a single hallway, long and narrow, lined with books that bled ink from their pages, not in streams, but in letters that dissolved into smoke as they left the parchment. The hallway led to a door with no handle, behind which stood the cloaked figure. Every time Elric approached, the door cracked open, but only slightly, and never enough to enter. On the 10th night, he woke to find the spiral had changed again, not the lines or their position, but the stone itself. The central slab, long, smooth, and gray, now bore a single raised sigil where the first page had originally appeared. The sigil was not one Elric recognized, but its meaning was clear enough. It was an invitation. A space had opened, and he was expected to step through it. Not physically, there was no portal, no gate, but magically, conceptually, he would be entering something older than dream, and younger than reality. He lit the chamber with the soft pulse of 5 candles, each set at one of the spiral's cardinal points. He prepared no spell. He spoke no incantation. He simply stepped into the center, placed his palm over the raised sigil, and whispered the word that had hovered at the edge of all his experiments since the beginning. Soften. The spiral did not flare. The room did not tremble. Instead, the light disappeared. Not darkness, not blindness, simply the absence of perception. And then he was standing in the hallway. It was exactly as in the dream, long, lined with books that bled smoke, with air that smelled of singed dust and dried ink. No sound, no footsteps, no heartbeats. The books whispered, not words, but syllables that tried to shape themselves into spells and failed, over and over again. Elric moved forward slowly, hands at his sides, mind sharpened to clarity. At the end of the hall, the door waited. No handle, no lock, just the faintest crack of space. When he reached it, the crack widened, not by his touch, but by his presence. The cloaked figure stood inside, taller than he remembered. Its face was still hidden beneath a hood, but he could sense its gaze, not hostile, not curious, but measuring. "You've come further than most," it said. The voice was not masculine or feminine, it was weighted. Ancient, not by age, but by purpose. Elric didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You believe yourself chosen," it continued. "You are not. You are persistent." Still, Elric said nothing. The figure stepped aside. Behind it was a pedestal, and on it, a single object, a quill, not ornate, simple, bone shaft, ink-stained tip. "The archive does not require power," said the figure. "It requires clarity. You have learned discipline. You have embraced silence. You have not asked questions you were not ready to understand. That is enough." Elric stepped forward. The quill pulsed once as he neared it. "This is not a gift," said the figure. "It is a burden. Anything written with it becomes true, not to the world, to you, and you will carry that truth forever. Even if you forget it, even if you outlive it." He reached out. His fingers hovered. "One last thing," the figure said. "There is no return, not from this, not from what comes after." Elric took the quill. The hallway vanished. He woke in the spiral chamber. The candles had burned to stubs. The third page was gone. The raised sigil had flattened. In his right hand, he held the quill. The ink had not dried, and he understood, without needing to be told, that he had become a part of the archive in a way that could never be undone. He wrote nothing that night. He didn't test the quill, didn't speak. He sat in the chamber until dawn, and listened to the silence, because he knew that whatever he wrote next would become part of him, and there were still truths he had yet to understand. He didn't touch the quill for 3 days. It remained wrapped in soft cloth and sealed within a cedar box lined with waxed parchment and inscribed with passive dampening sigils to prevent magical bleed. Elric treated it not as a weapon, nor a relic, but as a sealed word, a sentence not yet spoken, and therefore still holy. In those 3 days, he focused instead on silence, not as absence, but as practice. He spent hours in the spiral chamber, without casting, without reading, only observing how breath echoed off stone, how his heartbeat slowed when he stared at the center too long, how light drifted across the raised outlines of glyphs. He had memorized a dozen times, and still found slightly different each day. The quill was not a tool for power. That was clear. Its weight was too subtle, too certain, not inviting authority but confirming obligation. He felt that in his marrow, anything written with the quill would be irrevocable, not in the world, not in the eyes of others, but in himself. It would bind memory and meaning, in ways no traditional spell ever could. It was not meant to change the world, it was meant to commit to it. He tested himself. He drafted 3 entries by hand on ordinary parchment, with an inkless stylus, practicing what he might inscribe if the moment demanded it. One was a binding spell built from regret, structured around a memory of failure, fueled by the emotional resonance of his first abandonment at the Mage Academy. Another was a containment ward meant to hold certainty, a concept he knew couldn't be boxed in sigils or barriers, but might be caged by promise. The third was a name, not his, someone he had once known, long ago in the previous life. A name he had let fade. He stared at that page longest, then burned all 3 drafts in the lower basin, and watched the ash rise through the ventilation slats into the outside air. He wouldn't write until he was certain. The archives had given him this burden, because they recognized what he was willing to become. He had to be sure he didn't mistake willingness for readiness. The line between them was what separated dark mages from forgotten gods. Meanwhile, the town changed. Slowly, as all small places do. Rumors about the hollow shrine grew louder. A local mason swore he'd seen green light in the bell tower. A widow spoke of strange footprints in the frost around the chapel path, prints that stopped abruptly mid-step. The stewards petitioned the regional office for a diviner to investigate, and Elric intercepted the letter before it reached the courier line. He replaced it with another similar in tone and formatting, but worded as a retraction. No one questioned it. The steward who'd sent the original, an aging man named Varn, forgot he'd even written it. Elric had embedded a forget sigil into his ledger 2 nights prior. Subtle, targeted, ethically questionable, effective. He couldn't allow attention yet. The spiral wasn't ready. The chamber was stable, the constructs obedient, the wards layered and redundantly secured, but the archive had not spoken again. The figure in the hallway had made it clear, receiving the quill was not the end. It was the first proof. The door was cracked open. Now he had to walk forward without tripping. On the 5th night, the spiral shimmered. Not visibly, it remained exactly as it was, lines unbroken, center still. But when Elric sat within it, something in the world quieted, a thread pulled tight, as though the spiral were no longer simply a design or a container but a mirror, and what it reflected now included him. He placed the box with the quill at the center, removed the lid, waited. No page appeared, no voice whispered, but the air acknowledged the gesture. He could feel it, and then came the sound. It was faint at first, a breath between walls, like a page turning in a room that no longer had books. It came again, closer, not threatening. Curious, Elric didn't move. The spiral would hold. He had reinforced every vector. The breath formed words, not in the air. In his mind, not a voice. A shape, a pattern, right. Just one word, no instruction, no demand. He unwrapped the quill, held it, felt its balance in his hand. He reached for parchment, blank, untouched, laid it in front of him. He didn't think of power, he didn't think of history, he thought of memory, of the moment he had stood alone at 83, surrounded by books no one read, watching years erode like brittle bindings. He thought of the silence that followed, the silence of lost purpose. And he wrote, "I remember myself." The ink shimmered, the quill burned slightly. The parchment absorbed the sentence like breath into lung. The spiral changed, not in form, in presence. It was no longer a chamber beneath a chapel. It was part of something deeper, a system of memory and intention that extended beyond space. He felt the weight of the sentence settle into him. He hadn't declared a fact. He had recorded a truth, one that would not leave. Every truth, written with the quill, would stay. No erasure, no redaction. It would be carried within him, welded into the structure of who he was. He wrapped the quill again, sealed the box. It was done. The archive had accepted him. The next morning, a bird flew into his window and died. Its feathers were etched with inkless glyphs, not his. He dissected the body, preserved the bones, transcribed the glyphs. Each was a question. Each one pointed to a place not on any map. He understood. The archive was beginning to ask back. The death of the bird marked a transition. Elric felt it not in any single moment of revelation, but in the gradual change of atmosphere that settled over the town in the days following. The chapel ceased to be his center. He no longer lit every candle in the spiral chamber, or sat in silence waiting for new signs. He no longer hovered over the pages like a penitent acolyte hoping to be chosen again. The weight of the archive remained, always pressed behind his ribs, always there in the iron certainty of his memory and the quiet pull of the quill that now rested not beneath the chapel's floor, but in a warded compartment stitched into the lining of his coat. He carried it not as an artifact, but as a truth. It had been accepted, that was enough. The archive did not need him to kneel before it every night. It would follow him, echo behind him, reflect what he built from this point forward. He turned his attention outward. The first step was control, quiet, indirect, invisible. The town still thought of him as the bookish boy, the quiet son of the banker and the late school mistress, bright enough to earn a scholarship but odd enough to earn distance. That suited him. He cultivated it. He exaggerated the shyness, the late-night walks, the obsessive reading. He let his tutors believe he was wasting his potential with half-finished essays and strange metaphors. When the academy extension offered him a place again, he turned it down with well-practiced reluctance. Instead, he offered to assist the town's record keepers, volunteering time at the modest civil hall to help copy property filings and local tax ledgers. No one questioned him. The head clerk was an old man who favored silence over supervision and welcomed the help of a youth who didn't complain or speak unless prompted. Elric's true purpose lay in the papers, in the names, in the maps, in the old letters bundled with dried wax and forgotten agreements. He didn't need power spells or dramatic revelations. He needed leverage, and leverage lived in contracts, in the unpaid debts between households, in the overlap between property lines and inheritance laws, in the footnotes that contradicted each other in quiet ink scrawled decades apart. He began building a second ledger, not magical, not archive-touched, but sharp, precise, utterly mundane in appearance. A black-bound book with no title, its pages organized by street, by surname, by relevance. He learned who controlled the Butcher's Guild, and which cousin they hated enough to exclude from their deliveries. He learned which shopkeeper was 2 seasons behind on bribe payments to the stewards, and which steward's daughter was in love with a dockhand who had once killed a man in a knife fight. He didn't use the information, not yet. He simply recorded, layered, filed. By early midsummer, he had documented nearly a third of the town's interpersonal infrastructure. He started making changes: a delayed shipment of grain, a misfiled ownership document, a softly whispered suggestion to a board assistant that perhaps a minor misplacement of records was excusable under festival stress. Each move was small, each effect barely noticeable, but the town began to bend. Just slightly. The chapel gained an aura of feared reverence. Children dared each other to touch the door. The baker's wife claimed she saw a shadow move inside and left bread offerings twice a week. A wandering priest came through, asked too many questions, and was quietly escorted out by the stewards. Uncoordinated, unspoken, yet precise. Elric observed it all. He adjusted variables. He wrote nothing with the quill. He didn't need to. The world was malleable with the right pressure, and he had learned long ago that power used too early became noise. Then, near the end of the third week of heat, he received a visitor. He was in the upper hall of the civil office, copying old border disputes, when the door creaked open, and a young man stepped inside. Not young like a boy, young like a soldier who hadn't yet seen enough war to break, but had already started to question whether victory was worth it. He wore a courier's badge. His boots were polished. He moved like someone used to drawing attention and managing it. "You're Elric Danamore?" he asked. Elric looked up, blinked slowly. "I am." The man stepped forward, handed over a sealed letter. "You've been requested." Elric took it. The wax bore the crest of the provincial capital, not the academy, the administration. He waited until the courier left, broke the seal. The letter was short, formally worded. A visiting investigator from the capital's intelligence division had taken interest in recent property disturbances across 3 towns, all of which had experienced mild but unexplainable shifts in authority. While these changes were within legal bounds, the pattern suggested manipulation. The investigator would be arriving within the week. Elric was noted in the margins. As a person of unusual scholarly activity, he folded the letter, burned it with a minor incantation scrawled beneath the clerk's desk. No witnesses, no scent. Then he left. Back at the chapel, he sat in the spiral chamber for the first time in weeks, not to seek guidance, but to prepare. He reviewed every recent change he had made, every name moved, every signature redirected. The town wasn't fragile yet, but it was starting to lean in his direction. He had time, but not much. He needed to finish what he had begun. The investigator arrived 2 days later. Her name was Samara Klein, middle-aged, impeccably dressed in wool and reinforced silk, a travel coat lined with arcane threaded fibers, and a walking stick that doubled as a divination rod. Her eyes were sharp and without warmth, and she wore no badge, but everyone in town understood she outranked nearly anyone they'd ever met. Elric watched her from a rooftop as she passed through the market. She didn't speak often. She asked clear, specific questions and wrote in a small leather-bound book that glowed faintly when closed. By the 3rd day, she had visited 3 homes Elric had touched, each connected to his tests and social leverage. She didn't arrest anyone, she didn't accuse, she simply listened, and then she came to the civil office. Elric was already there, waiting behind a desk, sorting false documents. She introduced herself, extended a hand, which he shook with practiced politeness. "I understand you've taken an interest in archival work," she said. "I prefer patterns to people," he replied. Her eyes narrowed a fraction. "Patterns are made of people." He offered a slight smile. "Yes, but they don't lie about themselves as often." She studied him. "And what do you think causes patterns like the ones I'm seeing?" "Competing truths," he said. "Too many people trying to write history at the same time." She didn't smile, but she didn't press. "Would you walk with me?" she asked. He did. They walked the outer edge of the town, past the old smithy, past the fieldstone mill, past the chapel. Her eyes lingered on it. "Is that still in use?" "Only by myths," Elric said, "and children with too much imagination." "Children often see what adults explain away," she replied. He didn't answer. They parted at the fountain. That night, he returned to the spiral, lit the room with 5 candles, none placed on the spiral's edges. He wrote his second sentence with the quill. "She has seen enough to ask." The ink didn't shimmer this time. It sank, as if being stored, not for confirmation, for contingency. In the days following his second use of the quill, Elric began to notice how time itself seemed to slow within the spiral chamber, not through any dramatic magical interference or active manipulation of chronometric fields. Those kinds of spells were unreliable and ultimately crude. but in the subtle way sound lingered a fraction longer than it should. How the flame from a candle bent just slightly off-center and held that curve a moment too long before flicking back into proper rhythm. And how his thoughts stretched themselves, unwinding more slowly but with greater clarity, as though the space had learned how he thought and now shaped itself to accommodate the full expansion of each idea. The inscription, "She has seen enough to ask," had not caused a surge of power, nor had it summoned visions or whispers from forgotten gods, but it had done something quieter, more permanent, and perhaps more dangerous. It had shifted the archive's attention from passive to participatory. Elric could feel it now, not as a voice in his ear or a pressure behind his eyes, but in the weighted silence that followed him through the chapel, in the echo of his footsteps that no longer matched the rhythm of his stride, in the sense that each word he spoke aloud was being measured, weighed, and perhaps recorded. He took comfort in that weight. Samara Klein remained in the town longer than expected. On her 7th day, she stopped asking questions about property. She asked instead about stories. She asked the townsfolk what they remembered, what they had forgotten, what places felt different now than they had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and which names had disappeared from their collective memories without reason. She listened to a farmer who said the sun set a little more slowly over the chapel now, though he admitted he wasn't sure if that had always been true. She noted a seamstress's comment that she no longer heard birds near the northern grave path. Only silence, and even that silence sounded different from the silence elsewhere. She interviewed children, offering sweets and compliments, and asked if they had dreams about the chapel. Many of them had. She didn't write those dreams down. She closed her notebook when they spoke. She memorized them. Elric learned all this not by magic, but by method. He had 10 eyes in the town now, none of them spies in the traditional sense, none paid or threatened or controlled. They were people whose patterns he had learned so thoroughly, whose weaknesses he had tested and guided so gently, that they believed the things they told him were their own thoughts. A well-timed phrase, a correctly placed note, a brief question posed at the edge of a conversation. They were enough. He didn't need to bend anyone to his will. He only needed to shape the path in front of them, and let them walk it themselves. He studied Samara's questions. He traced their implications. He saw the net she was weaving, the slow, deliberate circling of a conclusion she hadn't yet allowed herself to articulate. She wasn't here to uncover fraud or administrative interference. She was here to confirm the presence of a pattern that did not belong. She was here to determine whether someone had begun to shape the narrative flow of the region without permission. That meant someone at the capital had already noticed the ripples. That meant time was running thin. Elric considered writing a 3rd sentence. He refrained. 3 was too soon. He had read the text that spoke of premature invocation, of minds broken open by truths they were not yet ready to host. The quill's power was not cumulative, it was directional. Each statement was a step forward, never back. He had to be certain that the path he carved now would still be walkable when the cost came due. He began engineering an exit, not from the town, but from exposure. He arranged for a series of false discoveries, a bundle of older documents, misfiled and warped by water, recovered from a collapsed shed near the mill, containing barely legible agreements, and small discrepancies in boundary line claims. He made sure Samara would find them, not by handing them over directly, but by leaving just enough of a trail that someone else, someone not connected to him, would discover them first. She accepted the find with professional neutrality, though Elric noted a shift in her questions afterward. Less direct. Less probing. Then came the lantern test. 2 nights after the documents were found, she left a lantern hanging from the chapel's outer gate. A simple oil lantern, glass cracked near the hinge, wick slightly misaligned. An object so ordinary it would have been unremarkable if not for the placement and the hour. Elric spotted it from a rooftop across the square. He did not move it, he did not approach, he left it burning, untouched, and when he returned the next morning, it was gone. He found no footprints, no marks, no trace of disturbance. He knew what it meant. She had made an offer, not a request, not a threat, a gesture of intention. Lanterns were a message in the old codes, an ancient method used by intelligence networks long before mirror crystals and telepathic sigils made such things obsolete. A lantern left at the threshold of a place meant the agent believed someone inside could see the world more clearly than those outside. It meant, I know you are here. I do not yet know who you are, but I am listening. Elric waited 2 more days, then he answered. He placed a folded sheet of parchment on the civil records table, where she would find it during her afternoon visit. On it, no name, no symbol, just a line of text written in a careful, neutral hand. Certainty is not required, only proof of intent. She read it, pocketed it, said nothing. That night, a second lantern appeared. this one unlit, a message in kind. I see you, but I will not follow unless you show me the path. Elric returned to the spiral, unsealed the quill, considered what could be written. He did not need to explain himself to her, but he needed to show her something real, something undeniable. He wrote, "She is not a threat. She is a test." The sentence did not glow. It hummed. Low, steady. The spiral deepened. A line at its outer edge, that had been stable for months now, shifted half an inch to the left. That was all. But Elric understood. The archive was paying attention. He watched Samara from afar. She changed after that night, not dramatically, but her path through the town grew less direct. She began asking questions not about history or ownership but about interpretation. She asked a weaver how she chose patterns for her tapestries. She asked a stonecutter why certain designs repeated across generations, despite no written records. She asked children what stories they heard whispered when they were alone. And then she stopped asking altogether. On the morning of the 13th day, she packed her things, left before dawn, said no farewells. But she left behind the lantern. This time, on the chapel's doorstep, lit, steady. Elric did not move it. He let it burn. The next night, a new page appeared in the spiral. Not placed, not summoned, grown. Its surface bore a single mark. An open circle, bisected by a vertical line. Recognition. A new chapter. He was no longer the only one the archive was watching, and he knew, without doubt, that the time to remain silent had passed. The town would not be enough. He would need more territory, more people, more stories to shape and fold. He would need to build a network of truth, bound by quiet power, and when the capital noticed again, it would not be with whispers, it would be with fire. He would be ready. The light from the lantern faded by morning. Its oil burned clean through the glass housing, without a flicker, leaving behind no soot, no heat, and no scent. The wick was untouched, preserved as if it had never been lit at all. Yet Elric knew with the same certainty that he knew the shape of the spiral in his bones, that it had burned precisely as long as it needed to. Samara had left nothing else. No messages, no symbols, no glyphs, etched into the frost of the stone steps, or whispered curses carved into the wood of the chapel doors. Just the flame, just the moment. Just a closing gesture, that meant one thing above all. She would not interfere. She would not report him. Not because she hadn't pieced enough together. She had, but because she had decided, in her quiet, relentless calculation, that the shape of what he was building needed to exist, even if no official channel could sanction it. Elric accepted her absence like one accepts the final note of a long song. There was no fanfare, no echo, just the quiet space that follows when something ends cleanly. He took the lantern, dismantled it, melted the glass over 4 nights into a prism, and used it to cast a fixed resonance ward on the chapel's entrance that reflected curiosity away like oil on water. The spiral chamber became still again, not empty, but rebalanced. The newest page remained at the center, its sigil bare unchanging, not inviting further interaction, but marking a point in his path that could no longer be crossed back over. Elric stepped around it each time he entered, now, not out of superstition, but recognition. The archive had grown quiet again, not dormant, not distant, merely satisfied. With the pressure of external attention withdrawn, Elric shifted his focus from protection to expansion. The town, though small, contained within it a microcosm of larger systems, supply chains, trade routes, civic structures, religious authority, informal hierarchies, all waiting to be mapped, not in ink or name, but in behavior. He'd already indexed the soft lines, who sold flour only to those who tithed, who fixed shoes for free if the child was quiet, who lowered their voice when talking about the steward, who paused when asked about the chapel. These details were seeds, and he had planted enough. It was time to let them grow. He began crafting new instruments of influence, not spells, not bindings, but tools of subtle reinforcement. The first were thought chains, barely detectable traces of magical reinforcement, woven into otherwise mundane phrases. They didn't force behavior, they didn't implant suggestions, they simply made certain ideas more comfortable to think again. If he spoke to someone and mentioned even briefly that the market felt safer lately, the next time they returned to the market, the thought would arise again, not like memory, but like habit. Repetition bred familiarity. Familiarity shaped truth. He layered these chains over existing conversations, adjusted them weekly, tracking their resonance through social behavior and speech patterns. He compiled a second ledger, separate from the archive's growing pages, composed entirely of phrases tested, their echo frequency, and the subject's rate of behavioral adjustment. Within 3 weeks, market activity had shifted by 2% in favor of vendors closest to the chapel. Not significant in revenue, in presence, the town's attention now passed the hollow shrine twice as often as it had before, casually, without thought, until the idea of proximity to it was no longer strange. The idea of its danger faded. He continued quietly threading his influence into places too minor to be noticed. A brief forgetting spell placed on a public notice board caused community events to shift schedule by half a day. A misprinted ledger at the tax office reduced fines for those who lived within 100 feet of the chapel road. A chance rumor spread through a misheard song lyric suggested that water drawn from the well nearest the grave path lasted longer without going stale. Each change was small, each effect barely measurable, but together they formed a current. Elric began to feel it move beneath his steps. The new space beneath the old mill became his second chamber. He had mapped it months ago, deemed it unstable, and left it untouched until the spiral's echo suggested it was time to revisit. It took 7 days to stabilize the walls, 12 more to remove the traces of lingering iron in the soil that disrupted spell matrices, and another 4 to reforge the foundation stone into a workable anchor for the glyph work. He didn't attempt to recreate the spiral that belonged to the chapel. This space would serve a different purpose, projection. Not casting, not summoning, but extension. He began crafting what he called a narrative loop, a containment field of thought pattern reinforcement that used ambient belief as fuel. It would not cast spells, it would cast assumptions. Beliefs fed by the town's own behavior, recycled through ambient impressions, and reflected back as patterns. If it worked, he would be able to instill consistency into the environment. Meaning, if a child believed that the old mill warded off nightmares, then the loop would make it so. Not through illusion, through reinforcement. He tested the first loop using an old superstition, placing a handprint in ash on a wall to ward off sickness. He inscribed a minor anchor sigil behind a beam, painted it over, and spread the idea through a brief conversation with a coughing merchant's wife near the healer's stall. She made the handprint. Others followed. Within 3 weeks, the street where the wall stood reported fewer visits to the apothecary. Correlation was not proof, but belief was more reliable than magic, if shaped correctly. By the time autumn began to brush red across the leaves, Elric had 4 loops running, one in the mill, one beneath the statue of the first magistrate, one hidden in the faded mosaics at the bathhouse, one beneath the well closest to the chapel. Each loop reinforced a different principle: safety, clarity, forgiveness, silence. Together they created a behavioral net. Elric monitored their strength through resonance crystals embedded in the chapel's lower floor, calibrated to flicker at specific frequencies. He began holding small gatherings, not meetings, not rituals, but conversations. He spoke to a baker about how strange it was that people felt less afraid lately. He spoke to a retired guard about the peace of early morning walks. He shared tea with the steward's assistant and mused on how quiet the town had become, how calm. The phrases were not spells, but they were received as if they were. People repeated them, not because they believed Elric was powerful, but because they believed he understood. That was all he needed. The next page appeared beneath the mill. It did not float, or shimmer, or manifest with sound. It was simply there, tucked into the space beneath a beam, dry despite the damp air, untouched by dust. It bore no phrase, no glyph. Just a symbol, an eye, partially closed with a single tear at its corner. Elric touched it. The tear darkened slightly, nothing else changed, but the resonance loops strengthened. The town grew quieter. Elric began recording his impressions. Not spells, not intentions, just observations. He wrote that the air felt thicker around the chapel, that birds no longer nested within 10 feet of its walls, that dreams remembered from within its radius faded faster if not spoken aloud. He wrote that people had begun to refer to the spiral chamber as the quiet place, even though no one but him had entered it. He wrote that a child had drawn the spiral in dirt near the well, unprompted. He knew then that the archive was growing not within him, but through him. Not cult, not religion, not magic, pattern, and all it needed now was shape. He began designing the shape. He called it a guild, not of magic, not of governance, but of story. A formal body dedicated to maintaining narrative equilibrium, ensuring the truth of things aligned with their consequences, that belief and memory coexisted without contradiction. It would have no formal leader, only a guide, a keeper. He would not call himself that, not yet. He spoke to the steward about the need for civic history. The steward listened, not because he believed Elric was important, but because the town had grown quieter under his watch. Within a month, the guild had its first 10 members. None of them knew they were members, but they all attended the gatherings, and they all left changed. The spiral welcomed the change. The archive approved. The town was ready. The capital would not be far behind. By the time the harvest festival arrived, the town had already begun to shift in ways that even the most skeptical among its citizens could no longer dismiss. The market stalls, once arranged haphazardly around the square, now aligned themselves in a pattern so symmetrical that the central path between them always remained open. No one had mandated this change, no steward had issued an ordinance, and no merchant could remember when it began, yet each of them obeyed the new flow as though it had always been there. Children avoided the chapel without needing to be warned, not out of fear, but out of deference, a quiet acknowledgement that the structure's silence was more profound than emptiness, and not to be disturbed. When travelers passed through, they remarked on the strange cohesion of the place, how peaceful it felt, how the air seemed cleaner, how even the shadows didn't linger in corners the way they did elsewhere. Elric walked these streets with the calm of a man who had already imagined every step he now took, and had calculated, tested, and redrawn each path until all deviation was deliberate. The archive remained quiet, content to observe. It no longer needed to guide him. It simply watched as he fulfilled the role it had already measured into him. The guild, still nameless to the public, had grown to 30 members, each brought in through implication rather than invitation. A carpenter was asked to restore the roof of an old storehouse that Elric had reinforced with passive memory sigils. After completing the work, he began to speak differently, using phrases Elric had embedded into local speech patterns. A widow who sold herbs in the market was given a new booth space after she'd begun placing quiet offerings at the well nearest the chapel, unaware that her actions were being mimicked across town. A retired soldier whose bad leg was eased by walking through a specific path near the bathhouse, now walked it twice a day and encouraged others to do the same. None of them knew they were part of something larger. That was the point. The guild's meetings were never called that. They were discussions, gatherings, or simply shared thoughts over tea. No symbols were worn, no vows were made, but each participant, over time, came to understand that Elric's words held more than meaning. They held shape. He spoke of cohesion, of shared memory, of the importance of stories told not to entertain but to preserve. He never quoted doctrine. He never referenced the archive. But every lesson he shared came from its logic, its silence, its weight, its insistence that truth mattered not because it was correct, but because it endured. The loops expanded, not just in magic, but in behavior. He layered a new resonance beneath the southern bridge, one that encouraged reflection, not the emotional kind, but the literal physical posture of stillness. Within weeks, people slowed their steps when crossing, some even pausing to glance into the water, not because they'd been instructed to, but because the idea had simply rooted itself in their habits. He placed another loop in the town square's flagstones, using a buried sequence of minor vibrations to reinforce the sensation of calm during disputes. The number of public arguments dropped sharply. The steward's records noted it with curiosity. Elric read the entries through borrowed keys and replaced them afterward without a trace. The second spiral chamber beneath the mill had grown more complex. It now contained a three-tiered system of thought-reflective glyphs, each keyed to different emotional frequencies. He had designed it not as a failsafe, but as a recorder. If he ever died or was removed, the chamber would preserve not his actions, but his reasoning. The decisions he made, the compromises, the calculations, the losses he had accepted for the sake of the town's balance. A future reader, if they ever existed, would find no grand treatise, no manifesto, only the unadorned architecture of his mind preserved in pattern and symbol. He began considering expansion in real terms. The next town over was called Westmere, a coastal settlement known for its fish markets and minor shipping routes. It had no spiral, no loops, but it had fear. A recent raid by sea bandits had left the people shaken, and the local watch was under-equipped and underpaid. Elric made no move yet, but he began collecting names, merchants with ties to both towns, travelers who spoke in both dialects, apprentices who had family across the border. He constructed pathways of speech, phrases he would begin introducing into circulation that would find their way down the coast. He wrote nothing with the quill. That was reserved for moments that altered his internal structure. But he felt the pressure building again, the sense that soon he would need to commit another sentence, that a truth was approaching which, once spoken, would not be survivable in silence. The child came during the third week of second month, a boy no older than 7, ragged, barefoot, silent as he stood at the chapel's gate just past dusk. Elric watched from the attic, eyes narrowed, not reaching for spellcraft, not invoking wards, simply observing. The boy did not speak. He waited. After 10 minutes, he turned and left. Elric found the footprints the next morning. They glowed faintly under the resonance field near the gate. Not magically, but meaningfully, like the dust had agreed to remember them. He followed them to the town's edge, where they vanished. No child was reported missing. No names were called. No parents asked questions. He knew what it was. A test, not from the archive, from something older. That night, he lit the spiral chamber with 9 candles, placed precisely along a new glyph that had appeared in a dream he could no longer recall clearly. He brought the quill, unwrapped it slowly, placed it beside a blank sheet of parchment. He thought of the boy, of his silence, of the way no one remembered him. He wrote, "I see the forgotten." The room cooled. A breeze swept the floor. The parchment burned, without fire. The ink remained in the air for 3 seconds longer than gravity allowed, then vanished. The archive did not respond, but the town changed. Children began reporting dreams again, this time of a boy who walked without sound, who stood near the chapel and whispered stories into their ears. Elric made no effort to suppress the tales. He encouraged them. He named the boy, the listener, and he made the listener the first myth of the guild. Not a god, not a spirit, a keeper of truths, too quiet for adults to hear, a symbol of memory, without weight. He planted the stories carefully, one in a schoolbook, another in a sermon, a third in the joke of a passing actor who spoke in rhyme only to forget the punchline. The spiral glowed for a full hour, the night after. He didn't write again, not yet. The myth would grow. It needed time, but the archive was watching, and Westmere was waiting.